Welcome on into the Fantasy Football Forge. My name is Steve, and it is time for the Week 11 wide receiver rankings. The running back rankings will be coming out tonight, and the quarterback and tight end rankings video will come out tomorrow, same time as this video, 8 a.m. So tune on in for those. As always, there will be changes throughout the week. You can find these rankings up on the website, www.theFFWatch.com. There's a link down in the description to all of the rankings, and you can see I do projections. I have them right on the screen, takes up a big portion of it. If you don't really care to see the projections, which a lot of them are quite similar this week, which has made ranking not the easiest, then you can just click on the little tab on the rankings tab up on the website, and you'll see this where it's just a little bit simpler of a view. So with that out of the way, let's find out what my first tier of wide receivers looks like. We're going to go through them in tiers. And my first tier, I believe, is going to be my top 10 wide receivers this week. Yes, going from my wide receiver 1, Nico Collins, down to my wide receiver 10. In between those two, we've got Jamar Chase, Cooper Kupp, Justin Jefferson, Puka Nacua, A.J. Brown, Amon-Ra St. Brown, DK Metcalf, Garrett Wilson, and George Pickens. And as you can see, I have George Pickens highlighted nice and green here because he's one of my loves of the week. I have 3 loves and 3 fades for the position, the wide receiver position, and just like starts and sits, it's a similar idea. Just pointing out guys who I think have a chance of having a really good week, and for obvious reasons for George Pickens going up against Baltimore and his recent success with Russell Wilson, it makes a lot of sense to play him. Now, I saw expert consensus rankings like 8 on him, and I saw that before I did my rankings, and I was like, that's absolutely insane. I'm obviously going to be putting like a fade tag on him. And then I saw it was against Baltimore. I'm like, okay, well, that kind of makes sense. Kind of. Well, when you look at the rest of the rankings and where this position's at, yeah, I ended up moving him all the way up here to 10. The projections don't quite work out. You know, there will be better projected players in this next tier. But I tell you, he's, I think, worth playing, as a must start this week. With that being said, obviously, it's set up to disappoint everybody because I'm not going to be the only one calling this out. I mean, this is going to be very commonly, I'm sure, a lot of people's like must starts, whatever you want to call them. So hopefully it doesn't kill us all. Last week I had 3 loves and 3 fades as well. How did I do with those? I like to be transparent. My loves were Devonta Smith, Darnell Mooney, Brian Thomas. Now, Brian Thomas, that was before the quarterback injury, so that did not count. Devonta Smith, that was before the A.J. Brown injury, so I did move him back in my rankings. It was still a disappointing week, of course, compared to the ranking, because he's just one of those guys who's boom or bust. And in the case of Darnell Mooney, also, I expected Drake London to miss that week, last week, and he didn't. But Mooney did manage to come through with a wide receiver 18 finish still, so that was great, I suppose. I don't really know how to, say how well or not I did there with the fact that all 3 of those circumstances changed. And then for my fades, I gave you Ladd McConkey, Marvin Harrison Jr., and DeAndre Hopkins. Ladd McConkey, DeAndre Hopkins both finished as wide receiver 43 and wide receiver 31. McConkey, wide receiver 43, Hopkins, 31. Those came true. Marvin Harrison Jr., surprised, going up against the New York Jets was a tough matchup, but he came through with a wide receiver 13 finish, so I don't know where that Jets defense is at. Are we going to be able to start targeting it? That's still like the second best matchup or worst matchup, I should say, against... I can't say it correctly. It's the second best matchup against wide receivers. The second worst matchup for wide receivers. With that out of the way, that brings us on to our next tier of wide receivers. This tier goes from my wide receiver 11 down to wide receiver 22, and it kicks off with Tyreek Hill, followed by Terry McLaurin, Drake London, Cedric Tillman, Deebo Samuel, CeeDee Lamb, Juwan Jennings, Devontae Adams, Darnell Mooney, Calvin Ridley, T. Higgins, and Jaden Reed. So I'll be curious to see Cedric Tillman, Juwan Jennings, if the experts end up going higher on them than they currently are. They're quite low on them, I believe. Juwan Jennings, somebody who I was high on last week, is we'll get to that in a second. He is one of my loves, but I do like to highlight a few players as well, just talk about them this week. I have 3 kind of rankings decisions that I came to where I didn't, I had a tough time figuring out which one to put higher, one on one. So kind of a start-sit type of question between this one is going to be Terry McLaurin and Drake London, and I ended up on Terry McLaurin for that. Terry going up against Philadelphia, who is a defense that has crept up and become one of the toughest units to pass against over the past 4 or 5 weeks. It's a really tough matchup, just like Drake London, who's going to be going up against Pat Surtain, which is a very tough matchup. Just last week, that was, why I had DeAndre Hopkins ranked lower, had him as a bust, was concerned about that. I do think Drake London goes into the slot a decent amount of the time, might be able to find a way to get, much like Drake London, to get away from that matchup, scheme him up some touches, but I'm definitely not expecting a big day from him, and nor am I really from Terry McLaurin, but I could see, that's kind of the guy there for Jaden Daniels. I could see him breaking loose, them scheming up a player 3 to get him, some fantasy points. I don't really feel comfortable having him ranked quite this high, but it's really tough to rank him a whole lot lower, especially when you consider, I've got Cedric Tillman right here, then Deebo Samuel, who has been maybe a little bit disappointing even so far this season. CeeDee Lamb, Jauan Jennings here. So CeeDee Lamb, we're going to keep in this territory for now. Still got quite a good target share. I think it's just, the yak, the touchdowns are just not going to be as highly anticipated as they were previously for CeeDee Lamb. But then that does bring us to my second love of the week in Jauan Jennings with an ECR of wide receiver 32. I feel that I have to stand up for this man in games without either Brandon Ayuk or Deebo Samuel this season. It's only 2 games. Jauan Jennings has 12 and 11 targets in those games respectively. He's stepped up as a wide receiver 2, and although I do not anticipate he'll have over 10 targets in every single game this season, he clearly has Purdy's trust, the play caller's trust, and he's stepped up big time into this role, and I believe it. Seattle can be had as a secondary. That's San Francisco's opponent this week, so I'm definitely not down on Jauan Jennings, and last week only strengthens my trust in this, really, for how much he got utilized. And then my wide receiver 20, Calvin Ridley, is also my third love of the week this week, going up against Minnesota, and that has a lot to do with it in concert, much like George Pickens, with his recent success. We have seen Calvin Ridley become highly reliable without DeAndre Hopkins being the only target in that backfield, and he's done it with both quarterbacks now, so that's great. I was a little bit concerned, will things change under Will Levis? I didn't think necessarily that they would, but I wasn't too positive. And when you give him a matchup against Minnesota, which is the second best wide receiver matchup so far on the season on a weekly basis via average fantasy points given up to the position, 2 wide receivers, I'm optimistic about it. I mean, who else is it going to be? For the most part, it's going to be Calvin Ridley who's going to be scoring the fantasy points, and I don't want to miss out on this game. So I'm doing my best to get Calvin Ridley into my lineup, even if I feel like I'm pretty stacked at wide receiver, which, once again, you will see. I mean, there's a lot of similarity going on at wide receiver. Look at these projections. Just not a whole lot of variance, and that's going to mostly continue. A little bit of a step down here into this next tier, which I think we can just get right on into. That starts with my wide receiver 23, Josh Downs, and it goes all the way down to my wide receiver 31. And at 23, after Josh Downs, we've got Zay Flowers, Devonta Smith, Cortland Sutton, Ladd McConkey, Jackson Smith and Jigba, DeAndre Hopkins, Khalil Shakir, and Tank Dell wraps that up at wide receiver 31. And you can see we've got a fade. My first fade will be starting after this tier. But you can see this tier from top to bottom kind of moving us down here. At the top, Josh Downs, Zay Flowers. Via the projection, they could be a good 7 spots higher than this. That's kind of what they've been on the season so far. But really bad matchups for the 2 of them, going up against the New York Jets and going up against Pittsburgh. Josh Downs, Jets. Zay Flowers, Pittsburgh. So a couple of notes on them and why I ended up ranking them in this order. And I can tell you it does help that we just saw the New York Jets get beat by Marvin Harrison Jr. for liking Josh Downs a little bit more for me this week. But that's not the initial tiebreaker for me. With Joe Flacco in at quarterback, Josh Downs has never had below 9 targets, and he has a game with 10 and another game with 12 targets. Zay, on the other hand, has games of 6 targets, 4 targets, 2 targets, and 1 target across to the entirety of the season. He also has several big target games. Don't want to take that away from him. I don't want to pretend like I'm hiding that. Outside of those games, his targets have maybe even averaged like 11 targets a game or something. Both the Jets and Pittsburgh are tough opponents. As I said, the Jets are actually a slightly tougher opponent on the season, but I decided to go with the more consistent receiver in Josh Downs. He is my wide receiver 20 on the season, whereas Zay Flowers is my wide receiver 25. That's on a weekly basis, so average fantasy points per week, accounting also for consistency along with that, my EV system. So it's very, very close. The argument for me is just the guy who's getting more targets is really what it comes down to, and who's consistently getting more targets is the more important factor there. So you combine that with Jets kind of melting down at this point, and that was my tiebreaker. Then I also had a tough decision here at my wide receiver 29-30. I do anticipate things will be shuffled around with these rankings, and I think I meant to get into this a little bit ago, but as a reminder, I go live on Thursdays 2 hours prior to kickoff, 6:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, so 2 hours and 15 minutes, and then I go live, or is it 1 hour and 45 minutes? Yeah, 1 hour 45 minutes, my bad. And then I also go live on Saturday evening, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, where we have a lot more time to chit-chat and discuss things, and I go until chat starts to die down completely, and then usually for another half hour after that, as it'll all sudden pick up. And then Sunday mornings, 2.5 hours prior to kickoff, about 10:30 Eastern Standard Time in the morning, I have been going live on Sunday mornings. So I keep an eye out for all of those times, of course, but that's where you can get my most recent rankings after I've done some changes throughout the week based on news that comes out and just based on reviewing these. Every now and then, I'll look at a guy and I'll be like, why did I have him ranked this high? What was I thinking? So it happens sometimes. But in this case here, between DeAndre Hopkins and Khalil Shakir, I wouldn't mind getting some of these guys a little bit higher, but this was just where I ended up landing on these two. Hopkins is going to be seeing a lot of Christian Benford, PFF coverage grade of 77.9 for Christian Benford. That's very high. That's very good. Buffalo allows an average of 23.4 fantasy points per game to wide receivers, which is on the lower end, top 5 type of number. And Kansas City's right there at 24 fantasy points per game for 2 wide receivers. Also one of those top 5, top 6 types of numbers here. Khalil Shakir has his own tough opponent. He's going to be going up against Shamari Connor, PFF coverage grade of 73.4. Also very good, quite high grade there. Shakir, technically, in both instances here, PFF grade of coverage grades for these guys that they're going to be going up against the most, and the matchup technically is in a little bit of a better situation. But ultimately, I will trust the talent of Hopkins. It's not all about situation in a rather tough matchup for both of them. That said, Shakir, I do believe, is the safer play, with or without Amari Cooper playing. But I do have Amari Cooper currently projected as playing, so you'll see him in the rankings, I believe. And then this tier finished up with Tank Dell. I am assuming Nico Collins is coming back with this ranking, as you would have seen earlier in the rankings. That's going to bring us on to my 4th tier, which is, I think, just before things go downhill in terms of the projections, but you can see we're kind of getting there. Jameson Williams is my wide receiver 32 this week, going up against Jacksonville. You might question why, and why is he a fade of yours? Well, I'll get to that in a second. After that, we've got DJ Moore, Brian Thomas Jr., Jacoby Myers, also a fade, and Jerry Jeudy wraps this little tier up at my wide receiver 36. In terms of Jameson Williams being one of my fades this week, the question is, to me, and I've used this tactic a lot in rankings, especially quarterbacks, is do we really believe that Jacksonville is going to be able to fight back to force Detroit to, take risky throws like the ones that you often see go to Jameson Williams, especially the ones that turn out to be really good for fantasy value. Are they going to be able to, keep up with them to force them to continue to pass throughout the game, to give more opportunities to Jameson Williams? I just don't think so. Not with Mac Jones, not from what we saw last week. And so I'm betting on, Detroit kind of clobbering Jacksonville, being able to run the ball a lot, not having to take such risks, and therefore the opportunities for Jameson Williams to shine being less so in this matchup this week. That's the concerns. Then we've got Jakobi Meyers, my wide receiver 35 on the week, going up against Miami. And when we talk about tough matchups, he's going to be going up against Jalen Ramsey, who is playing out of his mind this year. Definitely like a top 3, 2, I can't quite recall exactly, maybe 1 cornerback on the season. And I want to point out in general, and you can see it in the projections here, Jakobi Meyers is a really, really strong play rest of season in general. It depends on the matchup, of course. I believe we might have looked at this. He might have a tough schedule down the stretch, but regardless, it's going to be tough to sit sometimes, but this is one week where I really would like to. Jalen Ramsey probably going to have a good time shutting him down. I do not trust the talent of Jakobi Meyers to overcome that matchup. I do not trust the talent of the quarterback to help him get over a tough matchup, and I do not trust the talent of the coaches to help him get over and scheme him into better situations for this matchup. I do want to go back to, in terms of Jakobi Meyers, on a weekly basis, he's tied with Josh Downs as wide receiver 20 in my EV rankings. So he's been doing quite well and been overall quite consistent as well with that, getting a lot of targets. And that's going to bring us on to, I believe, the last tier. Not quite here. My wide receivers 37 through 42 begins with Romeo Doubs, followed by Rashad Bateman, Ricky Pearsall, Amari Cooper, Quentin Johnson, and Jalen Waddle. That was a lie. This is my final tier here, going up to wide receiver 42, and you can see clearly that the projections have now gone from being red to a lighter red into this white and blue territory, for the most part on both sides of the lower end and the higher end of the expected ranges here. So we're into a new caliber of wide receiver. I mean, clearly very much now into the less reliable flex type of options here. With Romeo Doubs, that's my wide receiver 37, followed by Rashad Bateman, Ricky Pearsall, Amari Cooper, Quentin Johnson, and Jalen Waddle. I feel like I did that twice. My bad. Amari Cooper is my wide receiver 40. I told you we would see him again in the rankings. You can see Amari Cooper, Quentin Johnston, because of their touchdown work for the most part here, I assume in both instances. Maybe it's a little bit different reasoning for Amari Cooper, but the higher end of the projection for these two is above, some of the guys that I have them projected behind in Pearsall, Bateman, and Romeo Doubs. But that is just how it is. Quentin Johnston, maybe we're not giving him enough trust yet, but it seems like, his production has been a bit reliant on the touchdowns, and it's not a bad matchup for that to continue, which is why I have him ranked 41st. But that brings us to my final fade of the week in Amari Cooper, going up against the Kansas City Chiefs. And unfortunately, Amari Cooper has only had a limited amount of time to develop chemistry with Josh Allen, so that's part of the equation here for me. It's not something that they've been able to develop that we've been able to see flourish to something full, and in a tough matchup such as Kansas City this week, specifically such as Jalen Watson, who is a top 10 to top 15 cornerback, still a very tough cornerback, well beyond above average in terms of his PFF grading. I'm not overly excited about the upside for Amari Cooper this week. I think even a guy like Khalil Shakir, who I expressed some concern for even when in his matchup, is probably the safer target to continue to go to. This week, and tight end, too, is a good spot for Buffalo to attack Kansas City. Hopefully Dalton Kincaid, or Dawson Knox. Either way, we know they're capable tight ends to take advantage. And I only have 2 guys who are not being ranked currently this week, and that is Michael Pittman Jr., Juju Smith-Schuster. I should add Adam Thielen in case he were to get called up. I don't know if he's going to quite get called to playing this week, but those are the 2 names that I have projected but have not ranked yet. And otherwise, you can find, as you can see, I have 76 wide receivers projected, so about 30 more than we went through in this video. Thank you very, very much, and a special thank you to the members of the channel. I appreciate you guys so very, very much. And that's it for this video. Peace out.